Laughter echoed through the marble hall as she tripped on her borrowed heels and fell at the head table. A waiter tried to help her, but the sound of breaking glass and the silence that followed were cut by an arrogant voice that pierced her chest like a dagger. Waste of time. Who let that thing in here? The voice was his, Ethan Vale, the youngest billionaire heir in town. The guests laughed obediently as she, teary-eyed, slowly stood up, clutching the remains of her dignity. Her rented dress was torn. The spilled glass of champagne stained her only pair of shoes. And even without saying a word in that moment, she swore to herself, he would remember her. Not for the scandal, not for the humiliation, but for something he would never have expected. Because that night he had laughed. But one day he would stand before her, and he would have to call her Excellency. Years later, in a cold, austere room in the central courthouse, Ethan Vale sat in the dock with a haggard look, his hair disheveled, and his suit lacking its usual shine. He had not expected that the trial of his life would be conducted by her. Yes, the same girl he had ridiculed in front of all of high society. Now she wore a black robe, her hair elegantly tied back, and her eyes steady as those of someone who had faced all hell in silence. When she banged the gavel to start the hearing, a thick silence filled the room. He could not look away. The girl he had called a waste of time was now deciding his future, not with vengeance in her eyes, but with a dignity that crushed him inside. And in that moment, even before the verdict, Ethan already knew. He had lost everything long before he was tried. The cold morning wind cut through the city sidewalks like an invisible blade, pushing old newspapers and dry leaves between the steps of the main courthouse. Inside, the hallways were still empty, but a security guard was already cleaning the floor with a cloth stained with coffee in haste. This was a city that did not forgive weakness, not in high places, nor in the shadows. And at the top of it, with a surname that weighed like an empire, was Ethan Vale, heir to a network of companies inherited from his father, a real estate magnate, owner of newspapers, hotels, politicians, and apparently the forced respect of everyone around him. Ethan was the kind of man who asked for nothing. He gave orders. His name opened doors, silenced investigations, solved problems with a cold and impersonal signature. Back then he was known as society's golden prince, the most eligible bachelor, and for many, the ultimate example of precocious success. His world was made of bulletproof glass, French champagne, and parties where no one was really friends with anyone else. People circled around him like satellites of convenience with artificial smiles and laughter calibrated to massage his ego. On that night of the incident, as he would later refer to it, Ethan had gathered his most influential guests for a lavish reception at the Vale Grand Palace, an ancient ballroom restored just to show that even history obeyed his will. Everything had been meticulously planned, from the menu served in 7 steps to the playlist chosen by a European DJ imported just for that night. It was more than an event. It was a stage for vanity, and it was on this stage that she appeared. A slip-up, a security breach, a presence he had not authorized. Ethan would never forget the way she appeared at the front door, with a dress that was too simple, a look that was too lost, and an insecurity that sounded like an alarm amid the trained laughter of that elite. But what he didn't know, or refused to realize, was that simplicity was not a sign of inferiority. It was resistance. She entered hesitantly, as if treading on ground that didn't belong, her eyes trying to find a safe spot amidst the golden lights and the judgmental faces. Maybe she had been taken there by a friend from work. Maybe it was a mistake on the list. But destiny, as always, had already written its script in blood and silence. Ethan, with a smirk, watched from a distance, not out of interest, but out of strangeness. She stood out from the scenery like a blur in an expensive painting. He laughed, first alone, then with his friends around him, and made the comment that, although brief, engraved itself like a hot iron in her soul. He didn't know her name, or her story, but he found it amusing to call her a waste of time. The phrase crossed the room, carried by complicit voices, and stayed there hanging like thick smoke. For a second she froze, but she didn't fall. She stood up with a dignity that no one there understood. She left without shouting, without crying, without returning an insult. She just left. But she took something with her that night. His arrogant look, the sound of his laughter, and a raw desire to never again be seen as invisible. She disappeared from the society pages, from the corridors of the company where she worked as a subcontractor, from the cafes where she waited for late buses. And for many years no one spoke about that night again. Except for him, at dinners, during cigars, between drinks, always remembering that moment as if it were an anecdote, never as a mistake. To Ethan, she was just a comical footnote in the biography of his success. Little did he know that she would not only come back, but she would come back bigger. She would come back without having to scream, without having to take revenge with hatred. She would come back with the only weapon he could not control: time. Her name was Clara, a name that no one at that party knew, but which carried too many heavy memories to fit into a social media biography. She was born in a forgotten village among hills and dust, where rain was a luxury and silence was a punishment. Her mother, a local seamstress, died early, leaving Clara in the care of a grandmother who was too weak to deal with life's absences. Her father, a truck driver who disappeared after an unpaid debt, left behind only an old photograph and promises that never came true. Growing up for Clara was like walking on broken pieces, always alert, always alone, learning from an early age that the world didn't care about discreet tears or cheap dreams. As a child, she sold candy outside bars to help pay for gas and rice. Her childhood was intertwined with the metallic sound of coins thrown in disdain. She learned to smile even when her stomach was burning with hunger, because she understood that no one gives alms to someone with sadness in their eyes. At school, she was invisible. Notebooks were donated, pencils were always borrowed. But there was something that no one could take away from her: curiosity. Clara was hungry to understand the world, not to get revenge on it, but to one day be able to breathe without fear. She read everything she could. She picked up old books on the sidewalk and read entire pamphlets just so she wouldn't lose the habit of words. At 16, she was already working as a cashier at a local grocery store. At 18, she got a partial scholarship to a night school, after months of insisting on getting someone to read her application essay. She studied in the same clothes for weeks, hid the circles under her eyes with expired makeup, and sat in the back of the classroom so as not to attract attention. On crowded buses, she devoured law books while everyone else slept. She had no time for distractions. She had no room for luxury. She lived each day as a silent battlefield. She worked during the day, studied at night, slept little, and ate even less. But she never stopped. When she got an internship as an administrative assistant in one of the Vale Group's commercial buildings, she cried alone in the bathroom on the ground floor. That was her first step into a world that, until then, only existed on a computer screen or in the unreachable shop windows downtown. She didn't want to impress anyone. She just wanted to survive. But even there, with a temporary badge and a simple uniform, I knew I was being watched like a foreign body. The women in the office looked at her with disdain. The men pretended not to see her, or stared too much. And Ethan, he never noticed her. Never, until that night at the party. Clara was only there because she had covered for her classmate who had received invitations from her cousin, the receptionist. I never knew it was a trap. But that moment of humiliation was just the last push she needed. When she left the party, Clara walked aimlessly through the streets until dawn. She took off her shoes, threw her dress in the trash, and promised that she would never again depend on anyone's charity. She used that pain as cement. She studied more, worked twice as hard, faced crises, falls, illnesses, and won public exams that many thought were impossible. Each approval was like pulling a stone out of her own chest. Each defeat, a new cut, that she learned to cover with dignity. But she never forgot. She never wanted revenge. She just wanted to go so far, so high, that no insult could ever reach her. The party where it all happened was not just another social event. It was the launch of the Vale Group's new philanthropic arm with press coverage, politicians in attendance, and a public promise of inclusion and social impact. On paper, it seemed noble, but behind the scenes it was just another marketing ploy to clean up the company's image after discreet scandals that were covered up by million-dollar settlements. Ethan wasn't there out of empathy, but out of vanity. His image consultant had convinced him to pose alongside representative faces, ordinary people who could humanize his image in front of the cameras. The idea was simple: invite people from humble backgrounds to join the party, as long as they knew how to behave as extras. That's when the bet came up. In the private backstage room, surrounded by friends in suits and influencers paid to praise his every move, Ethan made a cheeky comment when he saw the list with some random names suggested by local NGOs and low-level employees. "Let's see if I can figure out which one of them is the infiltrator this time," he said ironically. Everyone laughed. The game took shape. He had to identify in less than an hour who was really displaced, as he himself defined it. If he got it wrong, he would donate $50,000 to a foundation suggested by one of his friends. If he got it right, the prize would be the same: self-promotion. Their arrogance was so great that they didn't even realize how low they had fallen. And that was when Clara entered, shyly, led by a colleague who had received an invitation through a distant contact. She didn't know about the bet. She only knew that the event could be a chance to network, perhaps meet someone who could recommend her for a better internship, perhaps find some opportunity, or at the very least, see with her own eyes the world she had studied so much about in books. She entered, unsure but hopeful. Her dress was borrowed, her hair was tied up with discreet clips. She tried to appear neutral, invisible, but she only had to take 2 steps into the room for the trained eyes of Ethan's group to notice her. He watched her like a bored hunter. "There it is," he murmured to the others. It was her tone, the way she avoided their gaze, the way she held her glass in both hands. Everything about her gave away that she didn't belong here. They watched as if they were watching a cruel spectacle. She had walked up to the wrong table, been accidentally pushed by someone who didn't apologize, stumbled as she walked away. And then it happened. The fall, the broken glass, the silence, and the sentence: waste of time. The humiliation was public. Clara, kneeling, dirty, felt the weight of the collective laughter like an invisible flood. But no one there knew her name. No one there imagined that this silent girl would wear a toga in the future, that this episode would become a symbol not of failure, but of transformation. That night, she didn't respond. She didn't scream. She didn't defend herself. She just stood up with her face burning, her heart on fire, and a frightening serenity. And she left. While Ethan toasted, thinking he had won a stupid game, he didn't realize that he had just dug his own downfall, with his own tongue. Almost 2 years have passed since that night. For Ethan, the episode was now just a vague memory, reduced to an inside joke that was barely worth telling. His life continued at its usual pace: luxurious parties, commissioned interviews, empty conquests, and deals made with dirty handshakes. For Clara, however, each day after that was a step up in silence. She exchanged her internship for a position in a government law firm, won another public exam, and without fanfare, was accepted into the magistrate training program. Amidst piles of cases, sleepless nights and tears swallowed in the silence of the bathroom, Clara rebuilt herself in silence, not for revenge, but for dignity. The first direct encounter between the two after that night was no accident. It was a sultry afternoon, and Ethan had been summoned to provide clarification in a preliminary hearing for irregularities in public tenders involving one of his companies. He arrived late, as usual, surrounded by expensive and overly perfumed lawyers. His face had the usual disdain, that look of someone who never had to worry about the consequences of anything. She sat down awkwardly in the reserved chair, ignoring the looks in her direction, until the side door opened. She came in. Wearing a robe, with her substitute judge badge discreetly hanging on her shoulders, her steps firm and her gaze mixing confidence with the tamed pain of someone who had suffered too much. When she sat at the table, calmly leafing through the documents, she felt her heart beating differently. But she didn't show it. She had already learned to swallow her pain without anyone noticing. Ethan looked up, without immediately recognizing her. She was thinner, more elegant, and there was a serenity in her features that he couldn't name. But something there bothered him, as if a mirror had been placed before him. The session began with formalities, and Clara did not address him directly. She simply read, listened, and took notes. But one sentence from her was enough for the past to hit him hard. You are aware of the accusations that have been leveled at your company since 2018, including during the philanthropic event that marked the launch of the Vale Citado Institutional Image Project, correct? The mention of the party chilled Ethan. He looked up, and as if time had frozen, he finally recognized her. The eyes that had previously trembled were now steel. The girl who had fallen before him was there, standing above him, with the power not to hurt, but to decide. And the silence that followed was the first real punishment he had felt in his life. Clara noticed the subtle tremor in his hands, the confusion hidden in his eyes. But she said nothing. Her speech remained technical, precise, impersonal. She wasn't there to seek revenge. She was there because she deserved to be there. Ethan, in turn, began to sweat, still not knowing what he feared more: the legal judgment or the silent judgment of that woman he had ridiculed years ago. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something that would follow him like a shadow in the following days. Shame. Shame of himself, of his arrogance, of the certainty he had always had that he would never be caught by the consequences. But there she was, Clara, no longer invisible, no longer silent, just present, and enough. The following week, the newspapers began to speculate, not about the investigation itself, but about the strange expression on Ethan Vale's face as he left the hearing. He had lost his air of confidence. No reporter could get the old rehearsed phrase out of him. No camera captured more than a disoriented man who tightened his tie with trembling fingers and avoided any mention of the judge's name. And her? Clara continued her routine without showing off anything. The same discreet entrance to the court building. The same simple lunch boxes during lunch break. The same silent, but now sharp, firm gaze. What she carried was not power. It was justice. And the weight of what she represented began to haunt Ethan with a force he did not know how to face. When he was summoned for a new hearing, this time with members of the Internal Affairs Department and authorized press present, the scenario was different. The room was full. Lawyers, interns, representatives of public agencies, journalists. Everyone was attentive. Clara entered with the same calm demeanor. But for Ethan, it was as if the entire world was standing by to watch him fall. And that was no exaggeration. The lawsuits had piled up. Accusations of overbilling, contracts with shell companies, misappropriation of public funds disguised as social projects that only served to drain money. The shield that had always protected him was beginning to crack. And now the eyes turned to him with something he had never truly known: contempt. It was while reading one of the reports which mentioned the use of the Citizens Voucher Party as a front for money laundering that everything began to fall apart. A journalist inadvertently let out a muffled laugh as he quietly recalled the episode with the girl with the torn dress. Others heard him. A murmur ran through the room. Ethan turned pale. He tried to smile, tried to look away, but there was no shield left, because now everyone knew. They knew that the girl was her, that the judge in front of him was the same young woman he had humiliated in front of the elite. And not for revenge, but for pure sport. The public humiliation was now his, and it hurt. It hurt more than losing contracts, more than facing accusations. It was the irreversible embarrassment of realizing that the world was watching his mask fall, and that no one would pretend to respect him anymore. While she read the technical report, Clara didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to throw anything in his face. The coldness of the truth was more violent than any scream. And when, at an unexpected moment, the cell phone of one of the people present rang with an extravagant ringtone, everyone laughed, everyone except Ethan, because the sound reminded him of the same song from the party where he had mocked her. A tiny detail, but to him it sounded like a sentence. The humiliation was no longer symbolic. It was real, social, public, irreversible. He was no longer the admired man. He was the arrogant one exposed, the millionaire naked before history. At the end of that session, Clara left before he could even get up. She didn't even glance at him. She didn't give him the gift of her attention. And it was that silence that destroyed him more than any written punishment. Because in that moment, Ethan realized that he had stopped being important. And there is no greater punishment for someone who always believed he was the center of everything than becoming irrelevant to someone who was once called a waste. The city was buzzing. Legal blogs were cautiously commenting. Business circles alternated between silence and unease when mentioning her name. But for Clara, everything was as usual: spreadsheets, opinions, decisions, restless nights, and a deafening silence inside her. She hadn't changed her tone of voice. She hadn't used her position to make indirect comments or allowed her past to spill out in front of her colleagues. She was the same, at least on the outside. But on the inside, each day in front of Ethan was a living reminder of everything she had endured in silence. And even though she hadn't harbored a desire for revenge, there was a limit to even the strongest soul, and that limit had come. It was a rainy morning, during a private session, where only the main lawyers were present. A document had been attached at the last minute, and it needed to be personally signed by Ethan. Clara asked him to go into the legal support room alone, where she was waiting for him with the report on the accounting expertise. He hesitated, but went in. The door was closed. The silence between them was like glass, transparent, but at risk of shattering. With the slightest sudden movement, she looked up only after he had signed the document. And that was when she spoke. "Did you know exactly who I was that night?" she asked, her tone neutral, but her breath held. Ethan's eyes widened and he stammered, It was a party. There were a lot of people. I didn't—" She interrupted him. "You called me a waste of time, in front of everyone, and you laughed." The sentence fell like lead on the table between them. He didn't answer. He just lowered his, eyes. For the first time, Clara took off her mask of impartiality, but not to accuse, to free herself. "What you don't know, Mr. Vale," she continued, "is that I heard the bet. I heard your group betting on whether anyone would find out that I wasn't part of that world. I heard them laughing at my dress, at my posture. I heard everything, and I did nothing, because I knew it wasn't worth shouting at someone who only understood their own echo." Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers still on the pen, unable to put it down. "Since then," she continued, "there hasn't been a day that I've forgotten, not out of spite, but out of survival. Because that night, when you pushed me to the bottom of the well, I saw what was down there, and it was me, and that saved me." She took a deep breath, closed the folder, and looked straight into his eyes. "You never saw me. You never wanted to see me. And now you're here, in front of me, not because I need revenge, but because the world is like that. It turns, and sometimes it turns faster than pride can run." She stood up. He didn't say a word. Silence was all that was left. Clara walked to the door, but before leaving she paused. "I am not the judge of your past, only of the case that is before me. But know that the justice that brought me here was not that of the law. It was the justice of time, and it never forgets." The door closed with a sharp click, and in that room, Ethan was alone. For the first time, he had heard everything he had never expected, not shouts nor insults, but truths, and they were much heavier. Ethan left that room feeling different. It wasn't something visible yet, but a crack had begun to open up inside him. For the first time in his life, he had to face not only the consequences of his actions, but the reflection of his own character, reflected in Clara's calm and firm gaze. He returned home in silence, refused calls, skipped meetings, and canceled the party to celebrate his new venture that no longer made sense. The empire he had built on his image of invincibility now seemed fragile, supported by appearances. Sitting in front of his computer, late into the night, he decided to do some research. He needed to know who the woman who had disarmed him without raising her voice really was. What he found left him in shock. Clara Morera, born in a peripheral neighborhood of the city, motherless, father missing, raised by her grandmother who had died 5 years ago. She had worked since she was 12, passed public exams, graduated in law with a scholarship, completed specializations, and was approved as a substitute judge with the 3rd highest grade in the country. All without support, without a surname, without privileges. Every line of her trajectory seemed to silently scream everything he never wanted to hear, that the world did not revolve around his arrogance, that there was greatness in those he stepped on without looking. He searched even more. He found an old article from a community newspaper where she appeared as a highlight for having been approved in first place in a free law extension course. The photo was simple. She was smiling with a certificate in her hand and tired eyes of someone who had cried the night before. It was her, and now he remembered. At the party, that night, when she fell, even before the cruel sentence, even before everything, he remembered looking into her eyes for a second, just a second, and there was something there, a pain he chose to ignore, a truth he didn't want to see. But now he saw it, and it hurt, because it wasn't just the judge who stood before him in the hearings. She was the mirror of everything he had denied in himself, the ability to grow with dignity, the courage to continue even though he was invisible, the strength to never retaliate with hate, but with work. He called his lawyer at 3 in the morning. He asked for all the files related to the case. He wanted to understand how he had gotten there. And more than that, he wanted to know how far she had watched his escalation of cynicism and silence. But his lawyer only answered dryly. She never interfered in anything that was not legally permitted. She never asked for a transfer, never refused your agenda. She just followed her work, sir, and with excellence. Ethan hung up without a word. He stood up, walked to the window of his luxury apartment, and for the first time, he felt small, truly small, because the weight of what he had discovered was not just about her, it was about him, about who he had become, and who he had never dared to be. She disappeared shortly after the last hearing. There was no warning, no scandal, no sign of a break. She simply disappeared. Clara Morera's name was removed from the case docket and replaced by another interim judge. In the hallways, employees quietly commented that she had requested an indefinite leave of absence, citing personal reasons. No reporter had access to any further information. No official publication confirmed her departure. She was simply no longer where he had expected to see her. And for Ethan, the void that opened up was unlike anything he had ever felt. At first, he tried to pretend it didn't matter. He told himself it was better this way, that he no longer had to face the eyes that dismantled him without a word. But the days passed, and the silence grew. In the newspapers, his image began to crumble. The accusations multiplied. The lawsuits moved forward. His political allies distanced themselves like rats jumping off a sinking ship. But none of that bothered him as much as her absence. He realized he had grown accustomed to her silent, firm, dignified presence. He missed the weight she put into each word, the rectitude in the way she conducted everything. But what worried him most was the fact that he didn't know where she was, nor would he return. Ethan began to look for her. He discreetly sent his lawyers to find out where she had stayed, if she had traveled, if she had requested a transfer to another district. Nothing. Clara had disappeared like mist in the sun, and with her absence, he began to revisit places he had never thought he would be. He went to the old building where she had lived with her grandmother. He stood on the other side of the street looking at the worn facade, as if waiting for time to restore some lost image to him. He walked through the streets that she had perhaps walked in silence for so many years. He sat on a bench in a random square and tried to imagine what her life had been like while he, on the other side of the city, bathed in luxury and mocked others out of sheer boredom. The nights grew longer. He couldn't sleep. His house seemed too cold. The expensive furniture was empty. His car collection was ridiculous. His friends were gone. The women who approached him, interested in what was left of his fame, seemed even emptier than he did. And then he realized he didn't miss her like someone who misses a loved one. He missed her like someone who has been touched by the truth for the first time. Clara was the living reminder that he could have been someone better. And now that she was gone, all that remained was the echo of the words she had said. Words that weren't said to hurt, but to open wounds that he hid even from himself. One morning, he sat in front of the mirror and looked at himself for too long. He didn't recognize himself. And it wasn't because of the newspapers, the court, or the collapse of his business. It was because he no longer knew who he was without her there. Not because of dependence, but because Clara, with the simplicity of what she represented, had shown him the exact measure of dignity. And now, without that gaze that pierced him without asking permission, he saw himself naked. And finally, alone. The downfall didn't come with fanfare. It wasn't an abrupt scandal or a nationally televised arrest. It was slow, corrosive, almost sadistic in its steady pace. Ethan Vale, the man who used to grace the covers of business magazines, now graced quiet headlines with phrases like investigated, exonerated, charged. Government contracts were suspended. Strategic partners cut ties. The press, once controlled by his influence, began to ignore him, which, for someone like him, was even worse than being attacked. It no longer mattered what he said. The cameras were no longer on him, and the applause had stopped. The court scheduled a public hearing, with great repercussions for the final judgment of one of the most controversial contracts of the Vale Group. Ethan would have to testify, no longer as someone who dictated the rules, but as an ordinary citizen, vulnerable, observed. When he entered the courtroom, he noticed the change in the air. People no longer lowered their heads when he passed. There was no fear. There was judgment. The looks were no longer afraid. They were contemptuous. Whispers accompanied his every step. And everyone, they remembered. They remembered the mockery, the laughter, the waste of time. He sat alone. His lawyers were there, but far away. The judge in charge was different. The tone of the room was cold, institutional. What had once been a stage for his vanity was now an echo chamber for his downfall. The prosecution showed documents, videos, audios. Ethan barely reacted. The evidence was not just technical, it was moral. It was like mirrors showing not only what he had done, but who he had become. Someone who built everything on the shine of his appearance and the weight of his purchased silence. A man who laughed while others fell. A name that was now synonymous with decadence. But what hurt the most wasn't there. It was the absence. Clara wasn't in the room. And that for him was the greatest punishment. She could have gone. She could have sat as an observer. But no. She had disappeared from his world, and yet her shadow hung over every word he read, every sentence. Because everyone knew. Everyone had discovered who she was, and everyone was now judging him for it too. Because it was no longer about broken contracts or ignored clauses. It was about character. And the invisible court that crushed him the most was not that of justice. It was that of the people. On his way out, he was approached by a young reporter who looked him in the eye and asked, "Do you have anything to say to Dr. Clara Morera?" Ethan froze. No words came out. The cameras captured the silence, and it was this silence that went viral that night. Because sometimes silence says it all. Social media was unforgiving. Comments, videos, montages. The image of the arrogant man who once stepped on a humble girl just for fun was now circulating with phrases like waste, no, justice. And so the name Ethan Vale became a warning, a symbol, not of power, but of downfall. There were no more fans, no more parties, no more invitations. Ethan Vale began to live in the silence of his own thoughts, where the voices of the past could no longer be drowned out by loud music or purchased applause. The cold walls of the luxurious apartment, which had once served as a showcase for his success, now felt like a prison. He had lost contracts, credibility, allies, and above all, the character he had played for years. Everything that had sustained his image had crumbled, and what was left was the real man, without a frame, without a filter, without an audience. In the days following the trial, Ethan no longer appeared in public. He sold some of his assets, fired his marketing team, and dismissed his pompous lawyers. He began going out alone, with his head down, frequenting small cafes where no one recognized him, or pretended not to. He read all the books that Clara had mentioned in old interviews that he had stumbled upon. He took down the names of legal authors, philosophers, and texts on justice and dignity. He began to understand that he had never understood anything. He had never truly loved, never listened carefully, never seen beyond his own reflection. He even went to the neighborhood where Clara grew up. He walked through the narrow streets, saw the rusty streetlights, the windows with clothes hanging on the line, and the tired but lively faces. He sat in front of the old grocery store where she had worked and stayed there for hours. He remembered the day he had laughed at a fallen woman and how she had gotten up with a strength he had never had. He didn't cry, not yet. But something inside him was quietly unraveling. For the first time, it wasn't the fear of losing what he had. It was the shame of never having valued what really mattered. He went back to school, not to prove anything to anyone, but to rebuild himself from within. He enrolled in a restorative justice course without fanfare. He began attending social debate groups as a listener. He made anonymous donations to community projects, but this time without cameras. He visited shelters. He apologized to former employees he had treated with indifference. He didn't post anything. He didn't seek applause. He just went. Because he learned that true forgiveness begins with anonymity, and that humility is not a performance. It's a practice. And then one of those mornings when the sun seemed less hostile, he looked in the mirror and realized the man looking back at him was no longer the same. The clothes were still expensive, but the look carried something else. No longer arrogance. No longer pride. But an honest weariness, a silent regret, and a new way of seeking redemption. He knew that he might never be forgiven. And that was okay. Because he no longer did it to be accepted. He did it because he finally understood that no one is so great as to humiliate another human being and remain whole inside. The reunion happened in the most unlikely way. No courts, cameras, or witnesses. It was an ordinary morning at a low-key community mediation event hosted by a local NGO. Ethan had been invited not as a speaker but as a listener, part of a group of former business people involved in social reintegration projects. He sat in one of the plastic chairs in the modest auditorium, surrounded by people who knew nothing or cared little about who he had been. The light coming in through the tall windows was soft, and for a moment, he thought he might go unnoticed, that this day would be just another silent step in his attempt to rebuild himself. But then the event coordinator announced that the special guest that morning would be a judge who had distinguished herself for her work in restorative practices and conflict mediation. She waived protocol and asked us not to use titles, just Clara. Ethan froze. The name, spoken naturally, echoed in his mind like a distant and precise bell. He looked ahead with his heart racing. And when she walked in, time seemed to stop. Clara walked to the front with the same serenity as always. She was different, lighter, perhaps closer to herself than ever. She wore simple clothes, without the robe, without the distance of office. She spoke calmly, presenting experiences about active listening, reconciliation, the power of silence. And then her eyes met his. For an instant they both froze, but there was no resentment, no revenge. There was only recognition. Two people who crossed paths again, no longer on opposite sides of a courtroom, but on different sides of life that no longer required revenge. At the end of the lecture, She approached discreetly while the others dispersed. He stood. He didn't know if he should speak, if he should apologize, if he should just leave. But she broke the silence first. "You came." He nodded. "Too late, perhaps." She took a deep breath. Or exactly at the right time. Her gaze didn't carry accusation. It carried history, paths, burdens. She knew. She always knew. That certain encounters only happen when pride dies. And he, there before her, was no longer the man who had mocked her. He was someone else. Deconstructed. Naked. Real. They stood there for a few minutes. Unhurried. Unmasked. They didn't need to talk about the past. He didn't ask for forgiveness in words. But she saw it. In his eyes. In the way he lowered his head when he listened. In the way he remained silent without trying to justify himself. And that, for Clara, was enough. She smiled. And for a moment, he smiled too. Not a smile of relief, but of shared humanity. Then she said goodbye with a light wave. Left. And, without saying if she would return, without promising anything, just leaving behind something he had never received before. Peace. She didn't come back the next day, or the following week. Ethan, who had decided not to look for her anymore, remained faithful to that silence, as if respecting her space was his last form of dignity. Not because he had lost the desire to see her again, but because he finally understood that there are wounds that don't require return, only reverence. The image of her before him in that auditorium accompanied him like a sacred memory, not as punishment, but as a reminder of what can be redeemed not with words, but with actions. Time passed. He continued to change. He reduced his life to its essentials. He now lived in a smaller apartment on the simpler side of town. He participated in social projects discreetly, helped with legal mentoring in shelters and mediation centers. No one called him Mr. Vale anymore. He was just Ethan. And although there were days when loneliness hurt, he no longer felt the need to fill the void with noise. He learned to listen to himself, and he learned to accept that he might never be forgiven, and that this did not make him a worse man. It made him someone, finally, human. But the reunion didn't end in that auditorium, because one afternoon Clara sought him out. Not with big words or a theatrical entrance. She just showed up. She knocked on the door of the small room where he reviewed documents at a FAO community center. He looked up slowly, and there she was. The same one. But there was a different glow. Something less heavy, as if the weight no longer needed to be reminded. "I wanted to talk," she said, sitting down across from him naturally. Not as a judge, not as a wounded woman, just as someone who saw you become who you may have always been. Ethan didn't say anything. He just listened. Clara spoke calmly, remembering everything not with resentment, but as someone retracing a long and tiring road. She spoke of the pain, the shame, the strength she had to cultivate alone. And then she got to the point. "I forgive you. Not because you asked me to, but because I don't want to carry anything that ties me to that day anymore. The shame is no longer mine." He didn't know what to do with that. The words of forgiveness seemed too heavy to be received standing up. So he sat down. He breathed. And he cried. Not like someone who has been saved, but like someone who finally understands the depth of what he has caused. She didn't touch him. She didn't promise friendship or closeness. She just made it clear. She was at peace. And he too could be. Before leaving, she simply said, "There are things that justice can never touch. But time, silence, and truth, they heal." And she left. Without saying goodbye. Without saying goodbye. She just left. And in that serene absence, Ethan understood. The greatest gesture of love is forgiveness without return. And the greatest answer he could give was to continue being a better person, even without her. The rain fell lightly over the city, making trails on the windows of the small community library. Inside, The silence was broken only by the subtle sound of pages turning. Ethan sat at a table in the back, a book open in front of him and a forgotten cup of tea next to him, still steaming. Across from him, a group of young people were discussing an article on justice and empathy. One of them looked up curiously. "Have you ever met someone who changed their life without even apologizing?" he asked, addressing no one in particular. Ethan didn't answer. He just smiled, closed the book carefully, and stood up. He walked over to a bookshelf, ran his fingers over the names on the spines until he found one. He took it out and flipped through the first few pages, where there was a handwritten inscription, "To those who knew how to stand up without stepping. CM." He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he put the book back in its place. Outside, the rain was slowing down. At the end of the street, a female figure in a light coat and with her hair tied up walked slowly, protected by a transparent umbrella. She didn't look back, and he didn't follow her. He just stood at the library door watching. When she turned the corner and disappeared into the trees, Ethan smiled slightly, as if he had finally understood that some encounters never come back, because they had already left everything they needed to leave behind. And in that moment, he didn't feel empty. He felt free. If you've made it this far, it's because this story spoke to you in some way. So tell me in the comments. I also believe in the power of time. This simple sentence shows me that you felt every detail of this journey. Take advantage of this moment and leave your like. This helps the channel to continue bringing stories that touch the heart. And if you're not subscribed yet, click the subscribe button and activate the bell, because every week there's a new story like this made for you. Now, don't move from there. The video that is appearing on the screen will give you even more chills. Click and continue with me. The next story begins with a silence that changes everything.